Hey everyone, and welcome. I'm Divya Saini, your PGT history guide, and today we're tackling one of the absolute most crucial topics in your syllabus. We're diving deep into Chapter 1, the rise of nationalism in Europe, and specifically, we're looking at the French Revolution and the whole idea of the nation. Now, I know history can sometimes feel like this massive, intimidating wall of dates and names, but don't worry. In this explainer, we're going to break it all down visually. We're going to target exactly what you need to understand so you can confidently secure those top marks in your CBSE Class 10 board exams. Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll hit the spark of European nationalism, creating a collective identity, the Napoleonic Code, the mixed reactions to French rule, and then wrap up with your board exam key takeaways. All right, Section 1, the spark of European nationalism, where it all began. Okay, so before we get into the details, we really need to understand where this entire concept of the nation-state even came from. Because before this moment, Europe wasn't made of nations. It was really just a messy collection of empires, kingdoms, and small principalities. Then, boom, we get to the year 1789. If you're going to remember just one date from the start of this chapter, make it this one. This is your anchor year. Prior to 1789, France was a territorial state, sure, but it was completely under the thumb of an absolute monarch. There was literally no concept of citizens sharing a collective destiny. You just had subjects serving a king. The French Revolution in 1789 changed everything. It was the very first clear expression of nationalism in world history. So what actually changed in 1789? Well, it was a massive political and constitutional earthquake. The revolutionaries literally transferred sovereignty, which, by the way, is just a formal word for the ultimate power and authority to rule, away from the monarchy and directly to a body of French citizens. They stood up and proclaimed that from now on, it was the people who would constitute the nation and shape its destiny. They essentially took the power right out of the palace and placed it squarely into the hands of the public. Now I want you to turn your board exam radar all the way up, because this right here is a classic high-frequency long answer question. How did the French revolutionaries create a sense of collective identity? I mean, think about it. It's one thing to overthrow a king, but how on earth do you make millions of incredibly diverse people suddenly feel like they belong to one single united nation? Let's find out. Which brings us to Section 2, creating a collective identity and forging a united community. You see, the revolutionaries didn't just hope for unity. They engineered it with actionable, systematic steps. Take some mental notes here, because these points are the absolute perfect structure for a 5-mark answer. First up, they heavily promoted the ideas of la patrie, the fatherland, and le citoyen, the citizen. This really pushed the idea of a united community enjoying equal rights under a single constitution. Second, they tossed out the old royal standard and brought in the new French tricolor flag. Third, the Estates General was elected by active citizens and completely rebranded as the National Assembly, giving it a much more democratic feel. They also set up a highly centralized administrative system with uniform laws for everybody. And to boost the economy and tie the country together, internal customs duties were completely abolished, alongside adopting a uniform system of weights and measures. Finally, they discouraged regional dialects. French, specifically as it was spoken in Paris, became the common language of the entire nation. Seriously, if you get a question on a collective identity, this list is exactly what you need to write. Once they had France successfully united, their ambitions got a whole lot bigger. The revolutionaries came out with this incredibly bold declaration. They said it was, quote, the mission and the destiny of the French nation to liberate the peoples of Europe from despotism. So the key takeaway here is that this internal, domestic identity suddenly shifted into an external, international mission. When news of this started hitting other European cities, the educated middle classes and students got so inspired, they began setting up their own Jacobin clubs just to prepare the way for the French armies. They genuinely believed France was marching in to bring them freedom. Moving on to Section 3, the Napoleonic Code. Revolution meets administration. Now, as we know, the revolution eventually paves the way for Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon is a seriously fascinating guy for our exams because he brings this complex dual impact. On one hand, by declaring himself emperor, he effectively destroyed democracy in France. But on the other hand, he introduced some genuinely brilliant, highly rational administrative principles. You need to lock the year 1804 firmly into your memory. You absolutely must associate 1804 with the introduction of the Civil Code, which pretty much everyone calls the Napoleonic Code. Fun fact for you, parts of this exact code are literally still the foundation of French law today. And he didn't just keep it in France either. Napoleon exported this code to the territories he conquered, like the Dutch Republic, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. And looking at the details brilliantly illustrates why the code was so groundbreaking. First off, it completely abolished all privileges based on birth. No more special treatment just because of your family name. It established absolute equality before the law and officially secured the right to property. Furthermore, it completely wiped out the outdated feudal system, which freed peasants from serfdom and those heavy manorial dues. And in the towns, he removed the restrictive guild systems, which made life significantly easier for artisans and businessmen. This list right here is an absolute goldmine for your revision notes. But wait, there's a massive catch. The Napoleonic Code was definitely not perfect, and examiners absolutely love to test you on its limitations. The big caveat revolves around suffrage, which simply means the right to vote. Because despite preaching equality before the law on paper, the Napoleonic Code actually took a huge step backward when it came to political rights. It went right back to limited suffrage. Men who didn't own property, and literally all women, were completely excluded from any political rights. In fact, the code legally reduced women to the status of a minor, making them totally subject to the authority of their fathers and husbands. Let's look at Section 4, Mixed Reactions to French Rule, going from enthusiasm to hostility. So how did the rest of Europe actually feel about these French armies marching in with their shiny new laws? Well, we can really frame this as a massive psychological shift. Initially, in places like Holland, Switzerland, Brussels, Mainz, and Milan, the French armies were totally welcomed. People cheered for them. They were seen as harbingers of liberty, arriving to finally smash the oppressive kings of Europe. But, as you can probably guess, that initial enthusiasm quickly turned sour and completely shifted into hostility. Why? Because the local populations very quickly realized that these great new administrative arrangements did not equal actual political freedom. You'll want to memorize these exact 3 reasons why that enthusiasm flipped to hostility. First, the French slapped increased taxation on the everyday citizens just to fund their massive growing empire. Second, they brought in incredibly strict censorship laws to control exactly what was being said in newspapers and books. So much for liberty, right? And third, which was probably the worst of all, was forced conscription. Local people were quite literally forced to join the French armies to help Napoleon go out and conquer the rest of Europe. So the everyday advantages of the Napoleonic Code were heavily outweighed by these oppressive measures. Memorize these 3 points. It's a very solid 3-mark answer waiting to happen. Now, this historical cartoon we're looking at is a massive favorite for CBSE picture-based exam questions. It's so clever and incredibly sarcastic. It represents Napoleon as this grumpy postman trudging back to France after he lost the absolutely crucial Battle of Leipzig in 1813. Look really closely at the bag he's carrying. See the letters dropping out of it? Each one of those letters bears the names of the territories he just lost. It's a brilliant image because it completely strips the great emperor of his glory, showing his grand, terrifying empire quite literally falling out of his bag as he runs away. Finally, Section 5, Board Exam Key Takeaways, the Exam Cracker's Chronology. To truly master this chapter and guarantee those marks, you've got to firmly map out the cause and effect narrative in your mind. So here is your ultimate exam cracker's chronology. We start in 1789, the French Revolution kicks off, and sovereignty is officially transferred to the people. Moving into the 1790s, the whole idea of the nation starts spreading, and Jacobin clubs pop up all across Europe, eagerly anticipating liberation. Fast forward to 1804, the Napoleonic Civil Code is introduced, heavily streamlining administration, but at the cost of political freedoms. And finally, in 1813, the tide completely turns as Napoleon loses the Battle of Leipzig, which really signals the beginning of the end for his massive empire. But before we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to really ponder. If Napoleon's empire eventually collapsed and the old conservative kings immediately tried to take all their thrones back, how in the world did this incredibly powerful idea of the nation actually manage to survive and continue spreading across the rest of Europe? Keep that question rolling around in your mind as you review your notes today. I'm Divya Sani, wishing you happy studying and absolute success on your upcoming exams.